The herring came late that spring, and thin, and that was the first of the signs the old ones would later count on their fingers. But the sign no one wanted to name aloud came later, on a trader's schooner, in a word carried up the coast from Victoria the way a tide carries a drowned thing home, whether the shore wants it or not. The word was smallpox. It was moving north again, island by island, inlet by inlet, the way it had moved a generation before when it had emptied whole villages down to the ravens and the rain, and everyone on that coast who was old enough to remember went very quiet when they heard it, because they knew what it meant. And it was worse than hunger, and it was worse than the soldiers, and it was worse, even, than the men who came for the land. Telah, her name meant the returning tide, the high water that always comes back to fill what the ebb has left bare, and her grandmother had told her when she was small that a woman with such a name would always find her way home, no matter how far the water carried her, knelt in the last gray light at the edge of the tide flats and dug for clams with her fingers gone numb in the cold mud, and did the arithmetic a mother does. And it came out short, the way it always came out short now. The clam beds were fewer. The salmon runs were thinner every year, netted out at the river mouths by the cannery boats before they could ever reach the old family weirs. The cedar she wove, for she was a weaver, and a fine one. Her baskets so tight they held water, her mats and her cloaks made in the patterns her mother's mother had made. The cedar brought less every season from the traders, who wanted her work for pennies, and sold it in the towns for silver. Everything the sea and the forest had given her people freely for 10,000 years was being fenced and netted and priced and taken, a little more each year, and the taking had a patience to it that frightened her more than open cruelty would have, because you cannot fight a thing that only smiles and waits. She was 29, and she felt as old as the drowned cedars standing gray in the shallows. Behind her, in the big cedar house that had once held 4 families and now held barely 1, her 2 children waited. Quenu, the boy, his name meant the young cedar, the sapling that would one day be strong enough to hold up the roof of a house, was 10 and had gone quiet and watchful and too old for his years since the sea took his father. And Sola, the girl, the little wren, the smallest voice in the forest that sings the loudest at dawn, was 5 and still small enough to believe her mother could hold back the tide with her 2 hands. Telah could not hold back the tide. She could not hold back anything. That was the truth she turned over in the dark like a beach stone worn smooth. Her husband was 3 years dead, not by the sea, though the sea took men every season. He had died in the last time the sickness came, the smaller wave that had brushed their inlet and passed on, taking a dozen souls, and her husband among them. She had nursed him herself, alone, in a shelter apart, the way the old ones taught, and she had caught it from him and lived and been marked only lightly, a few faint pits at her temple, and made forever after unable to catch it again, which the old one said was the sickness's one mercy. It never took the same body twice. So she was not afraid for herself. She had never once since been afraid for herself. She was afraid only, always, entirely, for the 2 who had been too young to be touched by that wave, and who carried no such mercy in their blood, and for whom the word coming up the coast on the schooner was a death sentence not yet signed. And there was the other thing, the human thing, which came, as it always came, wearing a clean coat and speaking softly. His name was Sutton, and he owned the cannery down the Sound, the great stinking wooden works where the salmon went in silver and came out in tins bound for cities Telah would never see. And he owned, or meant to own, the shore, every good beach and river mouth and fishing station on that coast.
because the canneries were hungry for the runs and the land beneath the runs, and the best of it all,
everyone knew, was the old fishing station that had belonged to Telah's village since before there were tins or schooners, or men named Sutton, a curve of beach at a river mouth where the salmon came in so thick in the fall that a person could once cross the river on their backs, the old one said, and never wet a foot. Sutton wanted it. He had offered to buy it and been refused, because it was not a thing that could be sold any more than the sky could be sold. And Sutton, being a patient man, had simply waited for another way, the way such men always wait. And now the word coming up the coast had handed him one. He came to the village in his launch, with the Indian agent beside him, and he did not get down, and he was kind about it, the way the deliberate blade is kind. He spoke of the sickness coming. He spoke of how terrible it would be, how a crowded village like theirs, right on the water where every canoe passed, would be the first to catch it and the worst to suffer. And he spoke, gently as though it grieved him, of how the government had the power, for the good of everyone, for health, to condemn a village where the sickness took hold, to burn the infected houses, to move the people away to somewhere they could be watched and kept, a healthful distance from the shipping lanes and the settlements. It would be a terrible thing, Sutton said, ash-soft, for a village to be condemned and cleared and its people scattered. But of course a band that had come to a sensible arrangement about its unused shoreline, a band that had shown itself cooperative, orderly, a band the agent could vouch for. Well, no one would trouble to condemn them, would they? It would all depend, really, on how reasonable a people chose to be. He touched his hat to Telah, who stood in the doorway with her children behind her, and the launch pulled away down the gray water, unhurried, certain, the way men travel when they believe the law is a thing they carry in their pockets. Telah understood, standing in the doorway, the whole shape of it, and the shape of it was the cruelest she had ever seen. Sutton did not need to bring the sickness. The sickness was coming on its own. All Sutton had to do was wait for it to touch the village, and it would, crowded as they were on the open water, and then the health of the colony would require the village cleared, the houses burned, the people driven off to some barren holding ground, and the fishing station emptied of its troublesome owners would fall like ripe fruit into the cannery's hands, and every bit of it stamped and legal and done in the good name of mercy. The sickness would kill the people, and the law would take the land the dying left, and Sutton would never once have to dirty his clean coat. He had only to wait and be reasonable, and let the tide of it come in. That night Telah went to the old headman, the Sim, the honored one, old Tayo, who had signed nothing and given up nothing, and had grown thin holding the line, and whose eyes had the flat exhaustion of a man watching a thing he loves being taken, one grain at a time. She told him plainly, "The sickness will reach us. We are too many, too close, too much on the open water. And when it does, Sutton and the agent will burn the village and clear us off and take the fishing station and call it health. I have to take my children away from both, and away from the sickness and away from the clearing. Somewhere apart. Somewhere the canoes do not pass and the agent does not go and the sickness cannot easily reach, and there is nowhere like that left on all this coast but one place, and everyone is afraid of it, and I have to know if I should be." The old man was quiet a long time, and the fire spoke between them, and at last he said the name, low, the way people said it, half a curse and half a prayer. Skiana, he saw her not understand, and he explained, "The killer whale. It is what they call him now, because the killer whale is the one who outlives his whole pod and swims the inlet alone. There was a village on the far island, the one we do not go to, the one with the ghosts. When the great sickness came, a generation ago, it took that whole village, every soul, the strong and the weak, the old and the newborn, all of it, in a single terrible spring, so fast there was no one left standing to bury the last of the dead. Tayo's voice was very low. "All but one." He had had the sickness as a child, the small brush of it that leaves you marked and safe forever after, and so when it came again, it could not touch him, and he lived. Lived while his wife died, and his children, and his mother, and every aunt and cousin and friend of his whole life. And he buried them, all of them, with his own 2 hands, alone, over one spring, in the ground of a village that had no one left in it to sing them home. And he never left. He is there still, alone, on the island of his dead these 20 years. His face is deep marked from the pox. They say he is a ghost. They say he is cursed, that death lives on him, that to go to that island is to die. The old man looked at her. "None of that is true, and I will tell you the one thing that is. There is no living soul on this coast who has looked into the face of that sickness, longer or harder than that man, and no one else alive who cannot catch it and cannot carry it, and knows from 20 years of terrible schooling exactly how to nurse it and how to keep it from spreading. If the sickness is coming, Telah, then the safest place on this whole coast for 2 children who have never had it, the only safe place, is an island. The sickness already emptied once and can never empty again, kept by the one man in the world it cannot kill." He was silent a moment. "Go to him. Take your children to the island of the dead, to the man death forgot, and tell him the sickness is coming for 2 more, and see what he does." So Telah went in the gray before dawn, the way a hunted and a haunted people go. She took the family canoe, the good cedar one her husband had carved, and what dried salmon and clams there were, and her grandmother's weaving tools and her 2 children, and she pushed off from the beach of the only home she had ever known and pointed the bow toward the one place on all that coast that everyone feared, out across the gray and heaving water, past the last of the inhabited inlets, toward the far island with the ghosts and the emptied village, and the man death had forgotten, and, though she did not yet know its full weight, toward the sickness itself, which was already, even then, moving up the coast toward them all, patient as a tide. A man who lives alone on an island of the dead lives there for a reason, and the reason is never a light one. They said death lived on him. They said his face was so deep marked you could not look at it, that the ghost of his whole village followed him along the beaches at night, that any canoe that landed on his island would carry the sickness home. They said he had gone mad in his grief, or turned to stone, or become something that was not quite a living man any longer. They said the killer whale that swims alone is an omen, and that he was worse than an omen. He was the thing the omen warned of. And they said, this last most quietly, that in 20 years no one who was truly sick had ever been turned away from his shore, and that more than one dying family, cast off from every other beach on the coast in the terror of contagion, had drifted at last to the island of the dead, and been taken in by the ghost who could not die and nursed, and either buried gently or sent home living. But people did not like to dwell on that part, because it did not fit the shape of their fear, and fear likes to keep its shape. Most of it was closer to true than the people who said it knew. The crossing took Telah a day and a night and most of another day, out across open water that no sane person crossed alone in a small canoe, and the sea tested her the whole way. The swells, long and gray and cold. The wind coming up in the afternoon so that she had to quarter into it and bail with a cedar box, while Quenu held the little one down under the mat in the bottom, and Sola sang her small wordless song against the fear. Telah was a woman of the water, born to it, and she read the sea the way her grandmother had taught her, and she brought them through. But there was a stretch in the second dawn, with the far island, a low dark shape ahead, and the tide running wrong against a headland, when she understood how easily the sea could simply take them, the way it had taken so many, and she was not afraid for herself even then, only fierce, only certain, bending her whole body to the paddle. Not these two. Not these two. The tide always comes back. Take me if you must, but the tide always comes back, and it is bringing these two home. The island came up out of the sea mist in the failing light, like a thing remembered from a dream. She saw the old village first, or what the forest had left of it, the great gray house posts still standing along the beach, carved with the crests of a people no longer there to claim them, the roof beams long fallen, the moss and the young cedars grown up through the floors of houses that had once been full of firelight and children and the whole loud business of the living. It was the saddest thing she had ever seen, and the most beautiful, and she understood at once why people called it haunted, because it was haunted by absence, by the sheer weight of all the life that should have been there and was not. And at the far end of the beach, apart from the dead houses, there was one small house that was kept, smoke rising thin from it, a canoe drawn up, drying racks, the marks of a living hand. And as she brought her canoe wearily in through the last of the surf, a dog began to bark and then went silent, called off by something, and a man came down the beach to the tide line and stood and watched them come. He did not carry a weapon. That was the first thing she noticed, and it was its own kind of language. A man so long past fear of anything the living could do to him that he did not think to arm himself against a strange canoe. He was big, and gone spare and hard the way driftwood goes hard, and he stood with a terrible stillness, and his face. She made herself not look away from his face, because she had come to ask this man for her children's lives, and she would not begin by flinching from him. His face was deep-marked, pitted and scarred all over from the sickness that had spared his life, and taken everything that made it worth living, so that it was as though he wore always the mask of the thing that had unmade him. But the eyes in that ruined face were not a ghost's eyes. They were only very, very tired, and very deep, like water you cannot see the bottom of. And when they moved from her to the two children in the canoe, something happened in them, far down, that she would not have a word for until much later, when she understood it was the look of a man who had buried every child he ever loved being shown, without warning, two living ones. She brought the canoe up onto the shingle and climbed out stiff and salt-crusted and lifted Sola down and stood Quenu beside her, and she put a hand on each, and she said what she had come to say in the language they would both know, the language of that coast, and she watched his ruined face when she used it. "I am not begging." That first, because it was the one thing she had left that was wholly hers. "I have work in my hands. I can weave and I can fish. I can dig clams and dry salmon. I can doctor with the plants. I can keep a house better than one person alone can keep it. I am asking for shelter on this island apart from the world, and nothing more." She drew a breath, and the cold sea air burned it.
"The sickness is coming up the coast. My children have never had it. They carry no mercy in their blood. And a cannery man named Sutton means to let the sickness clear our village so he can take the fishing station and call it health."
So there is nowhere left for these two, not from the sickness and not from the clearing, except an island the sickness has already emptied and can never empty again, kept by the one man alive it cannot kill. She looked at him steadily, and she gave him the truth entire, because she sensed he was a man who had been given nothing but silence for 20 years and might not know what to do with anything less than truth. "The old Siemtayo told me what happened here. He told me what you buried, and how much of it, and alone. I am sorry past speaking to bring that back to your beach, but he said if there was one man on all this coast who would stand between a child and this sickness, it was the man death forgot. And I have no one else, and I have two." The man went very still, stiller than the stillness he had worn coming down the beach, a stillness that went all the way down. For a long moment he did not speak at all, and the sea worked at the shingle, and she watched the words, "The sickness is coming," and 2 children move through him like a tide moving into a cave that had been dry for 20 years. When he spoke at last, his voice was so rough with disuse it was barely a voice, more the memory of one, and he did not answer what she had asked. He answered something older and deeper. "What are their names?" he said, "not why should I."
"Not go away. Death lives here."
"What are their names?" As though the names were the first thing, the only first thing. As though a man who had had to learn every name in a graveyard by heart understood before all else that a child with a name still living on them was a child not yet given to the ground. "Quenu," she said, "the young cedar, and Sola, the little wren." He looked at the boy, who had lifted his chin and set his jaw and was doing his best to look worth the feeding. He looked at the girl who was 5, and Telah saw his ruined face do something at that, some private agony quickly mastered, and she did not yet know that his own youngest, the last one he had buried, had been 5. And something moved in that deep-marked face that had not moved in 20 years. A thing kept alive down there at unimaginable cost, showing through the mask the sickness had left him. "It will not take these 2, he said. And it was not a promise made to her. She understood that. It was a thing he said to the island, to the standing house-posts of his dead, to a wife and to children 20 years in the ground behind him. "Not this time, not while I stand up." He stepped back from the tide line and jerked his chin toward the kept house, and it was the same gesture she would come to know for everything he could not say. "Come up off the water before the little one takes cold. There's fish. There's dry wood. There's room enough." He turned and then roughly over his shoulder, in the language, as though the words were being drawn up out of a well that had been capped for 2 decades. "You read the water well to bring them across that alone. You did right. Whatever else, you did right to come." That was the first night. Telah lay with her children breathing against her in the warm cedar house of the man death forgot, and she kept her small knife near, not from fear of him. She had already, somehow, stopped fearing him, but from the habit of a woman who no longer gave trust on a single evening's strength. And near dawn she heard him rise and go out, silent, and she looked, and saw him standing far down the beach among the gray house posts of his dead village in the first light, not doing anything, only standing among them, the way a man stands in a house full of people he can no longer speak to. And she understood 2 things at once, that whatever the coast feared in this man was not turned toward her and never would be, and that he was, even now, keeping watch on the sea, on the gray line of the coast beyond it, the way a man watches for a thing he knows in his bones is coming. They did not become a family all at once. Those who tell such stories afterward like to say that grief melts strangers together, that need becomes love. But it is slower than that and stranger, and it is made of 10,000 small wordless things, and on an island of the dead it is made, most of all, of learning not to be afraid of what the other person is carrying. She learned him the way you learn a tide. She learned that he rose before light and walked the beaches of his dead village every single morning, all of them, a circuit, the way a man tends graves, which was exactly what it was. She learned that he could go a whole day and speak 5 words, and that the words, when they came, were worth waiting for. She learned that he had kept, in 20 years alone, the whole knowledge of his people alive in his own single body against the day there might impossibly be someone to give it to. The fishing and the weaving of nets, the reading of the sea and the sky, the old songs, the old names of every point and rock and current, the ceremonies that the new law had forbidden the living to hold. He had held them anyway, alone, for no one, for the dead, because to stop would have been to let the sickness finish the work it had started and take not only the people, but everything the people had been. And she understood slowly that his solitude was not madness and not curse, but a kind of terrible fidelity. He was the last library of a burned people, and he had been keeping himself alive the way you keep a fire alive through a long wet night on the bare chance that someone, some day, would come needing the light. The girl thawed fastest the way the small ones do. Sola was 5, and there was the dog and the astonishing beach and the tide pools full of small, bright, living things, and within a week she was following the deep-marked man everywhere, unafraid of his face in the way only the very young can be unafraid, and he pretended not to notice her, and one morning Telah looked out and saw him crouched at the tide line with the little girl beside him, teaching her, low, patient, in the language the names of things. This is the Khitan. This is the sea star. This is the cedar. This is the word for the way the light comes silver on the water before rain. This is the word for the little wren, that is you, that is your name. Hold on to it, teaching a 5-year-old the words one by one. And Telah understood, watching, that he was not only teaching the child. He was pouring a drowned world into the one small vessel that had come to his shore to receive it. Every word he gave her was a word saved from the graveyard, and the child's clear small voice, repeating them, was the sound of 20 years of terrible silence, at long last, beginning to break. The boy took longer, the way the boy always does. Quenu had made himself the man of his family too young. Since the sea took his father, and he watched the deep-marked man with a hungry, jealous, aching wariness, wanting to be taught the deep-sea craft the man so plainly held, furious at the wanting, ashamed they had needed a stranger and a ghost at all. It was Skana who broke it in his own slow way. One morning he did not walk the beaches of his dead alone. He put a paddle into the boy's hands, a good one, sized for him, one that Telah realized, with a catch in her chest, must have been carved 20 years ago for a son now long in the ground, and he said in the language, "A man of this coast reads the water, or the water reads him. It is the hardest knowing there is, and there is no faking it. The sea knows in one wave whether you are pretending. You mind me exactly, and I will teach you this water." And he taught him how to read a rip and a back eddy, how to find the salmon by the gulls and the seals, how to lay a net and mend it, how to bring a canoe through surf, how to know weather, half a day out, by the smell and the feel of the air and the way the swell came in. And the day the boy brought in his first spring salmon, netted entirely on his own reading of the water, Skana said nothing and praised nothing. He only nodded once, and the boy carried that single nod around inside him for a week, like a warm coal he was afraid to set down. The season deepened, and the word of the sickness came and went and came again on the passing traders' talk, closer each time, and Skana watched the sea. He never spoke of it directly, but Telah saw him make preparations that spring that had nothing to do with the fishing and everything to do with the thing coming up the coast. He readied a second small house far along the beach, apart downwind, with its own fire pit and its own water. A house for the sick, she understood, a place to keep contagion away from the well. 20 years of hard-bought knowledge going quietly into the timbers of it. He laid in extra water in cedar boxes and dried more fish than one household could eat, and he showed Quenu, without saying why, where the fresh spring rose highest on the island and where a person could shelter from a blow. He was, she understood, preparing for the sickness the way he prepared for nothing else, the way a man prepares who has already, once, been standing in the middle of the worst thing the world can do and been able to do nothing at all, and has sworn on 20 years of graves that he will never again be caught with empty hands. One deep night the girl woke, screaming from a dream. not of the sickness, which she was too young to remember, but of the sea, of her father's canoe not coming back, the family's oldest terror passed down into the child without words. Telah held her but could not reach her. And then the big, deep-marked man was there in the dark, kneeling by them, enormous and careful, and he did the only thing he knew. He began low and rough and halting to sing. It was a lullaby in the language, a cradle song of that coast, and Telah understood, hearing it crack and waver, that he was reaching for something he had not sung in 20 years, dragging it up syllable by syllable, his own wife's song, or his mother's, the thing he had once sung over the very children he had buried, and it did not matter that it was broken, because the little wren quieted against it and slept, and the singing of it was the man himself, at long last, being allowed to be a father in the dark again, even for one night, even for a child not his own. And Telah saw that his ruined face was wet, and she looked away to give him the dignity of it, and neither of them ever spoke of that night. But in the morning he brought the children the first salmon berries of the season, saved and hidden against exactly such a moment, and that was the only way he had of saying the thing he could not say, and she took it the only way she had, by cooking him the best of the catch and setting it down without a word. It was late in the spring, in the long gold evenings, when he finally told her. They had fallen into the way of sitting up after the children slept, sharing the small fire and the sound of the sea, and one night he looked into the coals a long time, and then he began in the language roughly, and she let him, and did not look at him, because she understood he could only say it to the fire. He told her about the spring the sickness came, 20 years before. He told her how it came on a canoe, the way it always came, in a person who did not yet know they carried it. How within a moon the whole village was down with it, the houses full of the burning and the dying, and no one well enough to fetch water for the rest. He told her how he alone did not fall, how he moved from house to house, from fire to fire, the one well man in a village of the dying, carrying water, carrying broth, holding the hands of people as they went, and how there were too many, always too many, more than any one man could tend, so that he had to choose, hour by hour, who to sit with and who to leave, and how the ones he left died alone while he was 3 houses away doing the same for someone else. He told her about his wife, about his children, 3 of them. He did not say their ages, but Telah heard, in the way his voice broke on the last, that the youngest had been 5. He had held each of them as they went, and when it was over, when the burning had passed through the village and out the other side, and left nothing living but one marked man and a dog, he had buried them, all of them, alone, over one spring, in ground too full to hold them all decently, digging until his hands were ruined, singing over each grave the songs no one else was left to sing, because if he did not sing them home, no one on the earth ever would. "I lived," he said, "and it was not gratitude. It was the deepest wound of all, said plainly to the fire. That is the whole of it. Everyone I ever loved, and every person who ever knew my name, and the whole world I was born into, all of it went into the ground in one spring, and I lived, because a fever had marked me as a child, and made me useless to death. I have asked the sea for 20 years why it left the one who was of no use. I have never had an answer." He raised his eyes at last from the coals, and the well had a bottom, and there was something terrible and living down there in the dark of it. That is why I stay, not because death lives on me, because every one I failed to save is here, in this ground, and I could not leave them alone a second time. And because his ruined voice went to nothing, and he had to find it again, because I told myself that if I kept it all, the songs, the names, the ways, everything alive in this one useless body, then maybe the leaving me alive would mean something. Maybe I was left to be the last house the fire didn't reach, but there was no one to give it to. 20 years, and no one to give it to. He looked then towards the corner where her children slept. "And then you come across open water in a small canoe, with a little girl 5 years old. And you tell me the sickness is coming for her, and I thought—" The words came out of him like something being born. "I thought, maybe this is the answer. Maybe the whole reason death passed me over, the whole reason I was left useless and alive on this beach for 20 years, was so that I would be here, on this island, on this spring, when a woman brought 2 children the sickness wanted, across the water, needing the one man in the world it cannot kill. Maybe I don't get to keep the ones I lost, but maybe I get to keep these 2. Maybe that is what I was left for." Telah was quiet a long while. The fire settled. The sea spoke its endless word against the shingle. Somewhere out in the dark a whale blew. A long, slow breath, and blew again, and was gone. At last she said, "The old Seam told me a thing before I crossed. He said a man carrying a wound like yours can go either way when the wound comes back to stand in front of him. You stood in the middle of that spring and could not save them. That is true, and it is not yours. It is the sickness's, it is the world's, it is no one's, it is a thing too big for any one man's hands. And you had 2 hands and a whole dying village, and you did more with them than any man alive could have done. That you could not do the impossible is not a failure. It is only the size of the thing. You have spent 20 years punishing the one man who ran himself to ruin trying." She looked at him across the fire. "And now the same sickness is coming for my Sola and my Kwonu, and this time you are not one well man alone against a whole village all at once. This time there are 2 of us the sickness cannot touch, and there are only 2 children to keep. And there is an island already made safe, and there is a house you have built apart with your own hands, and there is everything 20 years of the worst schooling on this earth has taught you about how to fight this thing. You could not save your village. You can save my children. That does not bring back your dead. Nothing brings back your dead. But it is how the debt gets paid, not by walking the graves alone forever, but by being, this time, when it comes, the man who stands where you once could only kneel. And when it is over," she said softer, "you will let me learn the songs and the names and the ways. You will give them to these 2 and to me, so that the last house the fire didn't reach is not the last house after all. Your people did not die, so their last man would keep them locked in his own chest until he died too. They died so that someone would carry them home. So carry them home, into the living, where they can grow." He did not answer, but something in him that had been clenched for 20 years eased just perceptibly, the way a fist eases when at last it is given something worth holding instead of only holding on. And after a while he banked the fire carefully and lay down and slept, she thought, better than he had in a very long time. And in the morning he took the boy out onto the water with something new in him, some spark that had only been endured before, and now, faintly, mattered. They were not yet a family, but a fire has to be small before it can be large, and this one had caught, though none of them yet knew how soon, or how terribly, the thing they had all been readying for would come across the water and put it to the test. Trouble on that coast did not announce itself. It came across the water in a fast launch with an engine, wearing a clean coat, carrying paper. It came in the early summer, in a flat calm, with the first true word that the sickness had reached the near coast at last. Was in the villages down the Sound, was in the very inlet Telah had fled, the houses beginning to burn. Sutton came, and the Indian agent with him, and a 3rd man Telah did not know, hard-faced, with the look of a hired constable, and they stood off from the beach in the launch, because even Sutton would not set his polished boots on the island of the dead, and Sutton talked pleasantly at length across the water. He talked about how far a woman had come to be difficult. He talked about how the sickness was now, sadly, officially in the district, which changed everything, which gave the authorities their powers. He talked about how the village Telah had fled was to be condemned and cleared, for health, of course, for the good of all, and its people moved to a holding ground up the Sound where they could be watched, and how the fishing station, standing empty now, was being purchased, all quite properly, all quite legal, forms filled and signed by the cannery, since the band could hardly be said to be using it any longer. And he talked, then, looking past Telah to the children behind her, about how it had come to the agent's attention that a certain widow had fled the district with 2 children who were properly wards of the government, to hide on a pest island with a known madman, exposing those children to who knew what, and how that was, in the agent's professional judgment, clear evidence of an unfit mother, and how the children ought, by rights, to be taken into the care of the school or the mission for their own protection, unless, of course, unless a woman chose to be reasonable, unless she came back and made no trouble about the fishing station and signed where the agent showed her, in which case the unfitness might be overlooked. The children left with her. Everyone spared such unpleasantness. It all depended, as ever, on how reasonable a person chose to be. And he glanced once at the deep-marked man standing silent at the tide line, and something flickered across his pleasant face that might almost have been unease, and he put it away and gathered himself to give the order to the launch. "Think hard," Sutton said, "and think fast. The clearing party goes to your village within the week, and once a thing like that begins, it's very hard to stop." He touched his hat to Telah, the courtesy, the deliberate blade, and the launch pulled away down the flat water, its engine coughing, unhurried, certain. That night the kept house was very quiet. The children slept. Telah sat across the fire from Skana and said the thing that had sat in her chest all day, like a stone pulled cold from the tide. "I should go back," she'd said, very low. "I should give him the fishing station and sign his paper and take the children home. What is a beach against my son and my daughter? Let him have it. Let him have all of it. I only want—" "No!" Skana said it the way he said the few things he was certain of. "Listen to me, because I have watched these men work for 20 years from the outside, the way the dead watch. If you go back into a village that is about to be burned for the sickness, with 2 children who have never had it, into the very place the sickness has already reached. You would be carrying them straight into the fire to save them from the smoke. And you would get nothing for it, because the paper is not really about the fishing station, and the fitness is not really about your fitness. They are about the shore. And once Sutton has the shore, 3 of us on a ghost island are nothing to him, and the sickness and the school will take what they take regardless, because men like Sutton always win twice if you let them. They take what they came for, and then they take everything else too, because you have given away the one thing that made you worth being careful with." He leaned toward the fire, and the light moved in the pits of his ruined face. "You do not beat men like this by giving them what they want, and you do not beat them by running further, because
there is no further than this island. This is the last edge of the world."
Shh. "And you do not beat them with the sickness on your side, because the sickness is on no one's side. It is coming for us here too, make no mistake. It will find this island the way it finds everything. And when it comes, we will fight it here, where I have made ready, where I cannot die of it, and neither can you, where there are 2 of us and a house built apart, and 20 years of knowing exactly how. We will beat the sickness with our hands. But Sutton," and something almost like the ghost of a grim smile touched the ruined mouth, "Sutton we beat the way men like him never expect from people like us. We beat him with his own paper. We let in the light." And he told her what he knew, for a man who watches a coast from an island for 20 years hears more than the living ever guess. from the traders, from the drifting canoes, from the missionary who came once a year faithfully to that fearful shore because he was the one white man on the coast, unafraid of it. And she told him what she knew. And between the two of them, a woman who would not bow and the last man of a burned people, the plan took its shape by firelight, while out beyond the surf the sea breathed its long, patient breath, and somewhere down the coast the houses of her home village burned. The fishing station, Skana explained, was not the empty nothing Sutton pretended. That was the whole trick of men like him. They told the people they had no rights so often and so surely that the people came to believe it. But there was a new thing on that coast now, a thing Sutton would rather no one thought about. A government commission sent up and down the inlets to mark out which shores and stations and village sites were to be kept as the people's own, recorded on maps, entered in a register, made, at last, into a thing on paper that even a cannery could not simply take. The commissioner had not yet come to their district. But he was coming, was working his way up the coast that very season, and a fishing station that a band had used since before the memory of the oldest living soul, a station with weirs and drying racks and graves and 10,000 years of use written into the very ground, was exactly the kind of place the commission existed to record as reserve. If it were recorded before Sutton's purchase went through, if the commissioner could be brought to see it and mark it and enter it, then Sutton's purchase of an empty shore would be exposed for the theft it was, a theft of land that was not the seller's to sell nor empty to be sold, and no amount of clean coats and filled forms would make it stand. And there was the missionary, the one white man unafraid of the island of the dead, who came each year and sat with Skana and did not flinch from his face, an Anglican of the plain, stubborn, unfashionable kind, who actually believed the words he preached about the least of these, and who had grown sick to his soul of watching the canneries and the agents feed on the dying. And there was a doctor at the mission hospital down the coast, a hard, honest, overworked man, who had begged the colonial government for years to send vaccine up the inlets to stop the sickness at its source and been ignored because it cost money, and the dying were only Indians, a doctor who would give a great deal to be able to prove, in writing, that a village had been condemned and cleared, not for health at all, but so that a cannery man could take its shore, that the health of the colony had been made into a weapon, that the sickness had been left to do a land thief's work. So Skana went, he, the ghost, the man who had not left his island in 20 years, went out across the water into the world of the living, and it cost him more than facing any sickness, because it meant going among people who would shrink from his face and whisper that death walked among them. But he went, because a boy needs a mother, and a mother needs a shore, and the dead need the living to carry them home. And he was done, he said, being useless and alive. He went to the mission.
He laid it all before the missionary and the doctor, the truth of the fishing station and its ancient use, the truth of what Sutton was doing under the cover of the sickness, the truth of a village burned so a shore could be sold.
And the missionary, who had a year's worth of such stories in his chest, and no proof, and no witness with the courage to stand, took it up like a man handed at last a lever long enough to move the stone. Letters went out to the commissioner, whose route was bent by the missionary's urging, and a bishop's letter behind it to come to their district now, this season, before any purchase could be completed, to the colonial authority that oversaw the agent with the doctor's own sworn account of a condemnation ordered for profit and not for health, and to a newspaper in the capital, for men like Sutton fear the printed word more than they fear God, because God is patient and a newspaper is not. It was not a gunfight, and that was the entire point, and it was the thing Sutton could not feel coming, because he was a man of the taking time, and could not sense the ground shifting under his polished boots. The old world where a rich man could take what he wanted on a far coast with a smile and a filled form, and no one of consequence ever the wiser was passing, slowly, unevenly, far too late for the burned village on the island and the thousands already in the ground but passing. And the day was coming, unevenly, imperfectly, when a thing written down and witnessed and printed could matter more than a threat, when even a cannery man could be made to answer. It was a corrupt age, and the paper far more often served the Suttons than their victims, but not always. And a woman who had crossed open water alone to the island of the dead had learned, Telah thought, that she must become very good indeed at finding them always. And then, as they had known it would, the sickness came to the island, and it came the same day as the reckoning, the way the sea sends its wreckage and its blessing on the same tide. It came in a canoe. A family, a mother, a father, 3 children, and an old woman, cast off from every beach on the coast in the terror of the burning, turned away from village after village because the sickness was on them, drifting at last, half dead, dying, toward the one shore on all that coast where the sick were never turned away. The island of the man death forgot. And they came in the teeth of a summer squall that blew up fast and vicious out of the southeast, the way those squalls do, and the canoe was foundering off the point. The father, too, fever-weak to hold it into the seas, the whole family about to go into the cold gray water within sight of the only shore that would have them. And Skana went out, into the storm, into the surf, into the heaving gray, the man who could not die of the sickness, rowing his own canoe out through seas that would drown any man, sick or well, to bring in the very people the whole coast had cast off to die. Telah stood on the beach in the driving rain with her heart in her mouth and watched him disappear into the gray and come back, and disappear and come back, ferrying them 1 and 2 at a time from the swamping canoe through the surf to the shore. The children first, then the old woman, then the parents, and on the last trip a sea took his own canoe and rolled it, and she screamed into the wind, and then saw him surface and swim and drag himself and the last of them up onto the shingle and lie there heaving in the rain, alive, having lost, this time, no one to the water, and she understood, hauling a fevered child up out of the surf beside him, that this was the thing the coast had never let itself understand about the man they called a ghost, that in 20 years no dying soul had ever been turned from his shore, that he had made of his useless, spared, immune life one single, unbending vow, that no one, ever again, not while he stood up, would die alone on his beach or in his water for want of one man unafraid to go to them. They carried the sick family to the house built apart, the plague house Skana had made ready, and there the long crucible began. The nursing, hand and body, through the burning nights, Skana and Telah moving among the sick who could not infect them, doing the 1,000 small mercies that are all anyone can do against that sickness, water and broth and cool cloths and clean bedding, and the holding of hands and the singing, so that no one went into the dark unheld and unsung. They saved the old woman. They saved 2 of the 3 children, and the mother. The father and the youngest they could not save, and Skana dug the graves himself in the ground of his own dead village, and sang them home. And the singing was not this time the singing of the last man alone. Telah stood beside him and learned the song as he sang it, and sang it with him, so that the newest dead of that island went into the ground, held by more than one living voice for the first time in 20 years. And in the worst of it, the sickness reached Sola. It found the little wren the way it finds the smallest and the brightest, and the fever took her fast and hard, and there came a night, the longest night of Telah's life, longer than the night the soldiers, longer than the night her husband died, when the child burned and didn't know them, and her small breath came shallow and rattling, and Telah, who had crossed open water and faced down Sutton and buried a husband, and never once broke at last, kneeling over her daughter in the plague house with the storm still muttering outside. And it was Skana who held them both, Skana who did not leave that house for 3 days and 3 nights, who sat with the burning child against his own scarred immune body, who dribbled water between her cracked lips a drop at a time, who sang the cradle song over her hour after hour in his broken rusty voice, the same song he had once sung over a daughter of his own, of exactly that age 20 years before, singing it now over another 5-year-old the sickness wanted, refusing, this one time, to let it win. Not this one, not while I stand up. You have taken enough from this beach. You do not get the little wren. And on the 3rd night the fever broke. The child's breath came deeper. Near dawn she opened her eyes, clear, and saw the ruined face bent over her, and was not afraid of it, and whispered a word, hoarse and small, and the word was a name, his name, that she had learned at the tide line in the spring, the name of the man who had sat between her and death for 3 nights. And Skana, the man death forgot, put his marked face down against the little living body, and wept the way a man weeps who has been given back, after 20 years, the one thing he thought the world could never return to him. She lived. She would carry a few faint marks at her hairline all her life, the sickness's small signature, the same the sea and the fever had left on her mother. And she would carry too, though none of them knew it yet, the whole living memory of a drowned world, poured into her at a tide line by the last man who held it. She lived. And with her living the sickness had done on that island all it was going to do, and passed, the way even the worst tides pass, and went back down the coast and out at last, having taken from the island of the dead, this time, far less than it had ever taken before. Because this time there had been 2 who could not die of it, and a house built apart, and 20 years of terrible knowledge, and a man who had sworn on a graveyard that he was done kneeling. The commissioner came in the calm after the storm, as the missionary's letters and the bishop's weight and a printed word in a capital newspaper had bent his route to make him come, and he came with the doctor and with the plain, stubborn missionary, and Sutton, who had heard, too late, what was moving, came racing up the Sound in his launch to find, on the beach of the very village he had meant to buy empty, the last thing on earth he wanted, witnesses and paper and light. The doctor had it all in writing now. The condemnation ordered before the sickness had even properly reached the village, the health clearance time to the cannery's purchase, the whole machinery of mercy turned into a tool for theft, sworn and dated and already lodged where it could not vanish. The commissioner walked the fishing station with old Tayo, who had come down at the missionary's word, and with Telah, and he saw the weirs and the racks and the graves and the 10,000-year-old midden deep as a house, and he heard the old man name every rock and eddy and season of the place in a language older than the colony, and the commissioner, who was no saint, who was only a functionary of a hungry empire, but who had a register to fill, and a bishop watching, and a newspaper sniffing, and no particular love for cannery men who made the government look like a fence for thieves, took out his book, and he entered the fishing station and its beach and its river mouth as reserve. The people's own, recorded, mapped on paper, in ink, a thing even a cannery could no longer simply take. Sutton stood on the beach in his clean coat and watched the ink dry on the thing that ruined him, and there was nothing left for him to buy and nothing left to threaten anyone over, and a doctor's sworn account of his health fraud already gone south to men who would use it because an empire will forgive a man a great deal, but not making it look bad in print. He left. There was nothing else for him to do. The agent who had served him was quietly moved elsewhere within the year, the way such men are always moved to fail on some other coast. And the finding of unfitness against Telah, with no shore left to be worth the taking, and a missionary and a doctor and a commissioner now all standing witness, that a woman had carried her children across open water to the one safe place on the coast, and there, with the help of the man everyone had called a ghost, had saved not only her own, but a whole drifting family. The coast had cast off to die. That finding simply lapsed, the way a lie lapses when there is no longer any profit in maintaining it. The children stayed. That was all that mattered. The children stayed. And then, in the calm, the thing happened that gave the whole story its name. The salmon came back that fall. They came the way they had come, since before there were tins or schooners, or men named Sutton. Up out of the gray sea into the river mouth of the recorded, protected, people's own fishing station, so thick some evenings that the water turned to mussel and silver. The great return, the gift that came home every year, no matter what the year had done. The tide of living silver that had fed that coast for 10,000 years and now, on paper, would go on feeding it. And Telah stood at the weir of her grandmother's with a dip net in her hands and her son beside her, learning the set of it, and her daughter singing the old thanking songs in her clear, small, marked and living voice, and the salmon came home, and she wept quietly, because she had forgotten the world could still do this, keep this one promise, send this one thing back. And here it still was, coming home, and she was standing in it, and so were her children. They did not leave the island. It had been made, over that terrible season, into something none of them had words for, and none of them needed words for. Skana rebuilt, not alone now. He and Quenu raised a new house on the beach of the old village, among the standing gray posts of the dead, the first new house on that shore in 20 years, and the raising of it was the boy's true coming of age, more than any paddle or nod. The day he set a house post with his own strengthening back, and Skana said, in front of the boy's mother, "He is a better hand than most grown men, and he reads the water like his father must have," and had to stop and put his scarred hand on the boy's shoulder, which for that man was a whole speech, and the boy turned to study the sea horizon very hard so no one would see his face. And the drifting family they had saved, the mother, the old woman, the two children, did not leave either at the first and then chose to stay. And then others came. For the word went out along the coast, carried the way all words are carried on that water, that the island of the dead was not the island of the dead any longer, that the man death forgot had come back among the living, that there was a new house on the old beach and a fire in it, and the old songs sung correctly, and the old names kept, and salmon in the river and a shore that was, on paper, the people's own, and that a person cast off, a person burned out, a person with nowhere left on all the changing coast to go, could point a canoe at the far island with the standing posts and find, against every fear the coast had taught them, not ghosts, but a home. The burned village, over the years that followed, began, impossibly, quietly, to fill again, not with the dead brought back, for the dead do not come back, but with the living come to keep them company, so that the songs Skana had held alone in his single body for 20 years were sung again by many voices over the same fires, and the world he had kept from the sickness was, plank by plank and voice by voice, given at last to people who could carry it forward. It happened in the end over something small. That is how the largest things always happen. It was the second fall, the salmon home again in the river, the light gone long, and gold over the water, and Sola, the little wren, the marked and living, 5 turned to 6, had followed Skana down to the tide line, as she always did, and slipped on the wet rock, and skinned her knee, and cried, and he picked her up in his scarred hands, and held her against his chest, until the crying stopped, and she wrapped her arms around his ruined neck, and without thinking, the way children say the truest things, called him by a word that meant father. The whole Gold Coast went still. Skana did not say anything. He did not correct her. He only stood there at the edge of the water with the small girl against him, the girl who was the age his own youngest had been, the girl the sickness had wanted and had not gotten, the girl he had sat between and death for 3 nights and would not give up. And his marked face bent slowly down over her small dark head, as though it were the most fragile and most holy thing the sea had ever carried to his shore. And Telah, coming down the beach with her heart in her throat, found him looking at her over the child's head, and everything neither of them had said across 2 years of silences and storms and graves was in that one look, and it did not need saying, and so it was not said. Later, when the children slept, they sat by the fire with the sound of the sea working the shingle, and the whole enormous, clean sky wheeling overhead, and for a while neither spoke. She didn't mean anything by it, Telah said finally, offering him the way out, because offering people the way out was a habit of hers. Children say, I know what children say. A pause. The sea spoke its endless word. And I know what I would want them to be able to say. He found the words one at a time in the firelight, like a man relearning a tongue he had thought was buried with everyone who spoke it. Their father, the sea took him, and he is theirs, always. And he will be in the stories, and I will help you tell them. I know to the bone what it is to keep the dead in the telling. I am not asking to take anything of his. He was quiet. I am only saying there is room, here, on this shore, for him in the telling, and for the ones I buried in the telling too, and for us. If you want it, and if you don't, that is a whole thing too. And you and they will have this island and my 2 hands as long as I have breath, and I will not say another word. It was the longest string of words she had ever heard him put together, and every one of them had cost him, and that was how she knew. She did not answer with a word. She reached across the small dark distance and put her hand over his, over that great scarred hand that had buried a whole village and rode a storm to save strangers, and sat 3 nights between her daughter and death. And she felt it turn under hers and close around it, careful, as though her hand were a thing that might break, as though it were the most precious thing the tide had ever brought him. And then she asked him the one thing left to ask. The songs, she said, and the names. All of them. Your wife's name, your children's names. I want to learn them. I will not let you carry them alone one more winter, and I will not let this island forget them when you are gone into the ground with the rest. Say them, out loud, where the living can hear and remember, and carry them on. For a long moment she thought he could not, and then, in the firelight, lo, he began his wife's name, and then his children's, one by one, the 3 of them, the last of them 5 years old forever, the names he had not spoken aloud to another living soul in 20 years, the names he had said only to graves. He said them, and his voice broke on them, and Telah took each name as he gave it, and said it back to him, gently, correctly, in the language, giving them back to him the way you give a person back a thing they thought was lost forever. And then she taught them, in the days that followed, to Quendu and to Sola, so that 2 living children learned by heart the names of 3 dead ones, and carried them, from that day, in the only place the dead can truly live, which is the memory of the living. And that was the moment, more than the hand or the look or the child's word, that the man came all the way home from the island of the dead, not to a place. For he had never left the place, but to the living at last allowed to belong among them again. They were not even then a perfect happiness, and she made herself be honest about it by the fire. The sickness would come again some day, as it always came, and the canneries would keep on netting the runs thinner, and the law would keep on bending to the powerful more often than not, and the potlatch was still forbidden, and the old ceremonies still had to be kept, half in secret, and the drowned world Skana had held would never be whole again, and no love, and no salmon, and no ink could bring back the thousands in the ground or the coast, as it had been before the schooners came. Grief does not end. It only makes room, if you let it, for other things to grow up alongside it. the way the young cedars grow up green through the fallen floors of the dead houses, the way the salmon come home every fall to the same river that took so many, the way a marked child sings the thanking song in a clear living voice over the very water that tried to burn her out of the world. But they had made a family out of strangers and out of grief, out of a broken lullaby and a road storm, and 3 nights between a child and death. And a family, she had come to understand, was not only the thing you were born into and could lose to a sickness in a single spring. It was also the thing you chose, over and over, out of the graves, to raise up green again. The choice you made each morning, like the salmon choosing the river that killed their fathers, because the river is also the only road home. It was a thing you tended precisely because you knew, better than anyone alive, how fast a whole world could go into the ground, and how holy and how stubborn was the one house the fire didn't reach and what it was for. Not to keep the dead locked away safe and alone, but to carry them home into the living where they could grow. The stars came out hard and clean over the water, the same stars that had looked down so indifferently on her digging clams in the cold the evening the word came up the coast a lifetime ago. They did not seem indifferent now. Or perhaps they were exactly as indifferent as they had always been, and the only thing that had changed was her, a woman sitting by a fire on a living beach, with her hand in a good man's scarred hand, her children safe and sleeping and marked, and hers, the new house standing among the old gray posts, the salmon thick in the river, the drowned names of a burned village learned by heart and safe now in 2 small living memories that would carry them 100 years. Either way, she thought, it was enough. It was more than enough. Against all the cold arithmetic of that coast and that age, it was a life, earned, imperfect, bought too dear, and quietly, stubbornly coming home. Out beyond the surf, a whale blew, long and slow in the dark, a killer whale by the sound, and then a second answering it from down the strait, 2 of them, a pod, not one alone. And the old dog lifted its gray head at the water's edge and listened, and finding all well, lay back down, and it was well. For now, on the living beach, they had raised against the enormous dark and the memory of the enormous dying, it was well, and the tide, going out, would come back before morning, the way it always came back, the way it always carries something home,